Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing perhaps the biggest matchup in probably and arguably maybe the entire year, but for damn sure within the first couple weeks of college football, which is Georgia traveling to Tuscaloosa to face Alabama, number one Georgia, number four Alabama, a rematch of the 2023 SEC championship game, which ultimately led to Georgia winning that game and going to the national championship game. Now, with that said, I mean, I think this matchup is really evenly matched, and it's great that both these teams are coming off of idle. Just for a quick recap, Alabama has so far been Western Kentucky, South Florida, and Wisconsin. They came off a great win versus Wisconsin. I mean, obviously, Tyler Van Dyke tore his ACL, and he just simply wasn't there during the game. But also, they looked really dominant defensively, and also Jalen Milroe is making a lot of incredible plays, and I'll get more into him. And then when it comes to Georgia, they pancaked Clemson. They, had a tune-up game versus Tennessee Tech, and then obviously barely got away with a win versus Kentucky. So, with that said, I mean, when you look at this game full circle, I mean, there's a couple things that I'm going to be keeping my eye out for. I mean, I think when it comes to, I'll start with Georgia first since they're the road team. I mean, I think as it stands now, I think it was justifiable a couple weeks ago for Texas to be ranked over Georgia simply because of how slow of a start that Georgia has had. I think one of the most obvious examples of Georgia kind of playing slow is particularly on the offense side of the ball. I think the defense has always been pretty consistent in the sense of okay, the defense, their front seven is always gonna cause trouble. Their secondary really doesn't give up that many big plays. I also want to point out that I think this stat really gets overlooked, even though we are talking about Georgia, Alabama here. But at the same time, like Georgia has yet to give up a touchdown, especially when you can make. I mean, I'll tell you this: Georgia's played tougher teams than Alabama has so far. So for them not to give up a touchdown at all versus Clemson Kentucky or Clemson, I think is an incredible stat. I'm not sorry, Tennessee Tech fans. I'm not throwing them in there, but in any event, I think they need to get more credit for that. Obviously, it's still the beginning of the season. We're only about to be a quarter of the way in, but you know, I think Carson Beck compared to last year, I think, you know, he is one of the more efficient quarterbacks in all of college football. He's been off to a little bit of a slow start, the one thing I give him credit for, he's efficient. He's smart with the football. He's a really strong leader, and he has really high football IQ. The one thing I always admire about him is, when he's dropping back to pass, you don't really ever see him looking down receivers too much. You really see him scanning the whole field, making sure that, I think Georgia's really good at offensively is being able to kind of get those chunk plays where, you can ask Trevor Etienne to get those 3 or 4 yard plays, or you can ask Carson Beck to, be able to drop back a little bit and find the open receiver, or to be able to get out of the pocket and throw the ball away when the play's not there. I think those sort of little things that I think often get overlooked for a lot of NFL fans, because obviously for NFL they're professionals and everything. In college, yes, to an extent you're a professional too, but not. There's a big difference. There's a big difference in terms of how quickly the game is for a college game versus an NFL game, and I think Carson Beck does deserve that credit too. And when I look at this Georgia team as well, I mean, offensively, the other thing I'm asking myself is if Georgia has any chance of winning this game, I think the big thing that's going to come down to is how is this Georgia offensive line going to look against what's a really tough Alabama defensive line. I mean, I feel like I talk about this on the show all the time, particularly when I discuss the Big Ten in terms of, games are being won and lost in the trenches. I don't know if that game is I don't know if this game I would classify it as that, because I think there's a couple other bullet points where I think a couple different things are a little bit more important than the trenches. But I think going back to Georgia's offensive line, I think they definitely struggled versus Kentucky, which I talked about in my last episode. They are, I would argue, a top 10 defensive line in college football. I mean, Lane Kiffin has compared them to be an NFL caliber. They pretty much shut down Trevor Etienne all last week. So when you think of that, or the week before, so when you think of that, you know, he also hasn't scored yet this year too, which I think is an incredible stat given we're 3-4 games in the year, and I think you have to get him involved more. I mean, especially when I think a lot of Kirby Smart's foundations have generally been, okay, we're going to play balanced pro style football. We're not going to turn the ball over. We're not going to make mistakes. And our defense is going to ultimately be the guiding force into what has now been multiple national championship wins under Kirby Smart. I think the one stat I want to add about Kirby Smart as well before I tie this all together is he is right now 1-5 versus versus Alabama, and I think I would argue that this is probably a bigger game for Georgia than it is Alabama because I think obviously the Kalen DeBoer, starting that legacy, goes without saying. And a lot of people say, "Oh, well, Nick Saban built the foundation," and yes, he built the foundation, but at the same time, I think we have to take into account that when Saban retired, due to his retirement, over 400 coaching changes were made. When you account for some of the other smaller schools, some of the positional coaches that changed, some of the players a lot of players transferred because Saban retired too. So Kalen DeBoer really kind of had to kind of reconstruct this team overnight too, which I think really doesn't get talked about enough. Talked about this Alabama team because we're just so used to seeing, oh, Alabama's in the top 5 or the top 10, so we're not really thinking about how much Alabama has significantly changed over this course of 6 to 8 months or so. So with that said, I mean going back to Georgia real quick, I mean I think they do have to get him involved somehow. I mean there's no way around it. I mean they have to start off quick. If they have the same kind of pedestrian start that we saw against Kentucky, or I guess yeah, I'd even argue against Clemson too, because that game didn't really take off until late second quarter, early third quarter too. So if you ask me, I think that's going to be a really key factor of the game is Georgia coming off hot, coming off quick, and really you know and really getting a strong start because I think this rushing attack could be one of the biggest storylines in terms of whether or not they win this game. And it really is going to come down to a scrimmage game where those third and four, third and fives that I talked about, those kind of chunk plays, because at the moment Georgia is only 39% on third down, and that is simply not good enough to beat a team caliber like Alabama. So I think if they do want to change the tide and really you know and really kind of start building this legacy of the Kirby Smart dynasty and possibly even repeating again. I think it's going to be really indicative that they get off to a strong start and they really try to silence that Tuscaloosa crowd as much as they can in Bryant Denny Stadium. So I discussed Georgia a little bit, and now I'm going to be shifting my attention to Alabama as well. I talked about this before. This is the beginning of Kalen DeBoer's legacy, and he's obviously he was at Washington last year, led him to the national championship game, and I do think he's a hell of a coach, and he's he I think he's starting to get to the point where he's building this team into what he wants, which is sort of his identity and kind of turning the next page, which I do sincerely believe he deserves a lot of credit for. And when I look at this Alabama team, you know, I would probably say out of all the games I watched the most were the Western Kentucky game and the Wisconsin game. And I think that the one thing that struck me out watching both those games was just how relentless that defense was. I mean, they were swarming to the quarterback. They were making him make mistakes. The secondary was playing really tight coverage on the outside, and Jalen Milroe obviously is a dog. He's one of the top quarterbacks in all of college football, and he I think the one criticism that you can give from him last year is that he really wasn't developed enough as a passer. Then now, fast forward to a year, I think Alabama has way more offensive weapons than Georgia does, which I give them a lot of credit for. I mean, you know, you had the freshman Ryan Williams who had 10 receptions last week. You have some running backs in Haynes and Jam Miller, so you do have some legitimate weapons there that I do think Georgia's really going to have to hone down and address covering all those guys too. And I think going back into this, if I'm Georgia, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making Jalen Milroe throw the football. I anticipate Georgia trying to do as much as they can to contain Milroe within the pocket. I think you have to find ways to make sure that that they don't get beat on those sort of speed options or read options where more often than not Milroe is keeping the football. But at the same time, I do think that Milroe does have a strong enough arm and he does have enough poise in the pocket where he can make those plays in really tight windows and those sort of things. But you got to imagine that that what Alabama really has to do is just more of the same in what they did versus Wisconsin and South Florida and Western Kentucky. You're just going to hope that Jalen Milroe is is playing to the level that he's been. You're gonna hope that you're not completely dependent on those sort of big explosive plays like you were the past couple weeks. I think if you're Alabama, I think you're in a very similar boat as Georgia in the sense of I think this game is going to be controlled within the line of scrimmage, and I think more than ever, this game is really going to be indicative of who can control the clock, who can who can win the time of possession, who's going to have less turnovers, and can Jalen Milroe really take over the game passing the ball, and then can Georgia find a more balanced attack by really getting the rushing game going? Because they are definitely evenly matched teams for the most part. I mean, I'd say offensively, I think Alabama definitely has the edge because they just simply have more weapons at the moment. I think you're going to find a little more creativity on that side, maybe perhaps even a little less predictability. Whereas Georgia, you kind of already know what you're going to get from that sort of team because Kirby Smart has built the foundation to be winning now and winning years to come. And you know, looking full circle at Alabama's defense as well, you know, I I mentioned the secondary briefly, and I mentioned how strong their defensive line is, and their secondary has always been pretty consistent. They can play bump and run coverage. They can play cover three zones, which I expect to see some guys out in the flat to be able to cover those 5 to 10 yard plays where that's kind of Carson Beck's bread and butter, where he can kind of check it down more and rely on those receivers to get those couple extra yards to ultimately get the first down. Where I don't anticipate him having as much flexibility as he did, going into these other games too. Because I mean, I think just like Kentucky, Alabama has a really tough front seven, and I think they are going to have to find ways to run the ball. But I again, I really do think this is more about Kirby Smart than Kalen DeBoer in general. I mean, I think right now, Kalen DeBoer, yes, he's in his first year and all of that, but I think right now we're just in such a win-win-win, such a now sort of thing that everybody's talking about. Well, he has to perform now, he has to do this now, he has to do that now, which is true, but in the state of college football that we're in right now, teams can change so much from day to day that when you're looking at this more in a worldwide lens, I think this is really, to me, more about, you know, can Georgia and Kalen and Kirby Smart really start the next chapter of sort of building that dynasty that I think can they be the ones to replace that Nick Saban dynasty in college football? And if Georgia can win this game, and I guess most importantly decisively, I think that would kind of be the mission statement, or the, you know, precipice for them to kind of be building that legacy. So with that said, I think there's two evenly matched teams. I think, both teams sort of have an idea on what they're gonna do to each other. It's gonna be electric out there. They're they have college game day there, which is always a great time. I think right now, if you ask me, I think on paper you give Alabama definitely the edge, primarily because of the offensive weapons and the fact that Georgia really hasn't had, you know, much strong starts going to this year at all. Even going into the Clemson game, they really didn't get going until the late second quarter, early third quarter, and a lot of their their plays were on defense. But I think on paper you have to give Alabama credit, but I wouldn't be surprised if Georgia goes in there and wins a close one. I do anticipate this being a little bit of a lower scoring game. I'm kind of looking at a 2017, 24-20 sort of game where, it's I think it is going to come down to the fourth quarter, and it is going to come down to who makes less mistakes, who can control the ball, and who's going to win that scrimmage battle.